I'll start by introducing myself for those of you who don't know. A lot of you do, but I'm Cody Tony. I am the director of the Pervasive Parenting Center. I'll start with that quickly. The Pervasive Parenting Center, we're a resource center. We're located in Poto, Oklahoma, on the campus of Carl Albert State College. We help families with resources, find the resources that they need. We do a lot of trainings. We do autism screenings. We do social groups. We do peer mentoring programs. We do a lot of different things for families with all disabilities. But autism is kind of our specialty because that's kind of our go-to. And I'll tell you why here in just a minute. But we do work off of a grant from the U.S. Department of Education, the Office of Special Education Programs. They pay us to come out and basically help you guys and do these trainings. Everything we do is free of charge, thanks to the grants and to donations and fundraisers that we do. So if you guys are interested in donating, and I'm just throwing this out, we do have a way to donate on our website. Just go to pervasiveparentingcenter.org or .com, and it will bring up a way to donate. It helps us with all of our programs. So, all right. So again, I'm Cody Tony. I am the father of two. I have two boys, Connor and Cruz. Cruz is 11, and Connor just turned 15 last month. And at the age of 3, he was diagnosed with autism. And at the time, I didn't really know anything about autism. I couldn't tell you really much about it. So I started doing some research, and I found out 2 different things. In rural eastern Oklahoma, where we live, resources are limited, and what is here, most people just don't know about. So in 2014, my wife and I started the Pervasive Parenting Center. We're a nonprofit organization, and I've already told you a little bit about what we do. And we've just kind of grown from there. But basically, we're here to help any families, but especially, any kind of disability we work with, whether it be physical, mental, developmental, it doesn't matter. We're here to help in any way we can. So let's get into the first part of this is going to be about autism, what it is, why the people on the spectrum have the behaviors that they do. And then the second part of this is going to be how can we help cut off some of the behaviors, because I think it's important that we understand why we're having the behaviors to begin with, in order to head them off ahead of time. Okay, so it is a neurological disorder. It is characterized by a couple of different things, and I'll show you here in just a minute. So if you look over here on the side, and I don't know if you guys can see my pointer or not, but so this on the right is what they call an Asperger's brain, or some, they don't even use Asperger's anymore. It's autism 1, 2, and 3. Don't ask me why they did that. Just probably to drive people like me crazy. But what they did is they did a scan. They asked a quote unquote normal brain, or as we call a neurotypical brain, and then somebody on the spectrum, the same question. And if you can see on the right, that brain is firing off in about 100 different directions, and it's taking a long time for them to process. Let's say they asked picture a church, okay? And so if I ask you guys to picture a church, then what you're doing is you're going to picture either the one that you go to on Sunday, or maybe as a child you something that you saw, maybe something close to home. But you're going to take that and you're going to process that and pull in that information, and then it's going to look mostly like this brain over here on the left, okay? But it takes a lot longer for somebody on the spectrum because now I've been told that this is actually a scan of Temple Grandin's brain, and if anybody knows who Temple Grandin is, she's an adult on the spectrum. If not, then that's okay. She just know that she's pretty impressive. You can go do some research on her. But basically they said, if I ask you to picture a church, she says, I've got to think of everyone that I've seen in a book, in a movie, on the way in, whatever the case may be. And then it takes me a lot longer to process that information down from here to here, from the right to the left, and until I get what I think you want to see in a church, okay? So think of that if we're talking to a child on the spectrum and we're trying to get them to go get their shoes and put them on a shelf, okay? It's going to take them a lot longer to process that information. And so for me, it took me a long time as a parent to try to figure out, basically, if I tell my son to do something, because my blueprint was my dad, okay? My dad was strict, military guy, and if I tell you what to do, I want it done now, okay? But if I tell my son on the spectrum that, then we've got some issues, because it's going to take him a lot longer to process that information and do what I'm trying to tell him to do, okay? So why does that happen? Well, again, it's neurological, and we have a hard time with communication. So these are the things that they look for when they try to diagnose somebody on the spectrum. Communication is one of the biggest problems, okay? Communication is not just verbal. Only about 7% of what we say is verbal. There's also body language. There's inflection. There is emotion, facial emotion, and those things they don't pick up on quickly. If anybody's ever watched The Big Bang Theory, I always tell people I'm raising a little Sheldon, because that's kind of what he's like. You have a hard time picking up on emotions, on sarcasm. I mean, that's lost on a lot of them. And so when you have these problems, you're going to have communication issues. Well, with communication issues also comes social interaction. Hey, if I can't speak the language, we're going to have some issues with social interaction, right? Think of it this way. If I were to go to a foreign country and I can't speak the language there, we're going to have a lot of anxiety going on if I can't tell you what I need, especially let's say I need the baño, right? I don't know how to say that, but so we have a lot of issues. And so you see, one thing that I always talk about is if it can cause a lot of anxiety. Okay, we'll see that here in just a minute as we talk about some of the different diagnoses that go along with this. So give me just a second here. I'm working on. Okay. All right, and then restrictive, repetitive, or rigid behaviors. Routine, routine, routine. You see kids on the spectrum constantly. Everything has to go in a certain order. And by that I mean lunch has to be at this time, and bedtime is at this time, bath time is at this time. And if you break that routine to the point that if you're going to grandma's house and every day you go to grandma's house the same way and you take the same route, and then suddenly one day you decide you're going to take a shortcut and you go a different direction, that can actually throw off their routine, and you will have some serious issues because they like that sameness, that routine, repetitive behaviors. So those are the three main things that they look at when they diagnose for autism. Let me stop for a second and explain to you guys that before we go any further, I'm not claiming to be an expert. I'm just a dad that basically has done a lot of research and worked with a lot of people, and that's where we came up with a lot of this. So I'm not a doctor. I'm just a dad. And so what we are using in this are things that we've used with my son, but also we've worked with a lot of schools. We worked with a lot of, I know that I've got a lot of Head Start people on here. I've worked with the Head Starts. I've worked with a lot of people, and these are things that we've seen through working with them that have actually worked. This is where we just talk about once you've met one child on the spectrum, you've met one child on the spectrum. They are all different in their own way. Okay, so let me see here. It's not working for me. Why? There we go. Okay, usually begins during the first 3 years of life. Symptoms range from mild to severe. So it is an autism spectrum disorder. It's everything from what they used to call Asperger's or high functioning autism to severe and profound. You can have intellectual disabilities on the severe end, but you can have genius levels on the high functioning end. So there's a lot of in between. I mean, it's just completely crazy, the spectrum on this thing. Here's what it's not. It's not a mental illness, although it can develop into mental illness, and we'll talk about that here in just a minute. It is neurological, remember that. It's not a child who chooses to be unruly or misbehave. My kid is not acting out just because he's a brat, okay? And I have this, and no offense to teachers, I love teachers. In fact, I'm married to one, but a lot of times I hear teachers tell me, well, he just hit that kid for no reason, or he just did this for no reason. That's not true. If he is doing something, there's a reason behind it. It takes a little bit longer for us to figure out why he did those behaviors. So he's not choosing to be unruly or misbehave. There's a reason there, and we'll talk about that later on. It's not a result of bad parenting. Again, this took me a long time because my dad was my blueprint. I had to change everything I knew about being a parent because those things don't work for me that worked for my dad. Okay, so I'm not a bad parent. I'm just trying to reinvent how to parent my child, if that makes any sense. So what does it look like? Well, everybody probably has their own in mind. This is what it looks like to me. Connor is on the left there. That's his brother Cruz on the right. Connor he's just pretty much your typical 15-year-old to a certain extent, and we'll get into that. So if you look on the right-hand side, it says interest are Thomas the Train, Roblox, Minecraft, Angry Birds, SpongeBob, computers, pets, wrapping up in blankets, Connor sandwiches, which we'll talk about in a little bit, taking baths, dislikes Dora the Explorer, loud noises unless he makes them, which is most of the time, and his brother Cruz most of the time. So if you look, he basically looks like your average kid. There are a few things, though, that stand out. He's 15 years old, and Thomas the Train is still his life. Everything he does revolves around Thomas the Train. And by that, I mean he loves Roblox, but he builds trains on Roblox. Minecraft, he builds trains. Everything revolves around Thomas the Train. And at 15 years old, that's not typical. Usually they outgrow that, around 6, 7, 8 years old. So he still has some maturity issues, and we're still working on some of that. But I mean, for the most part, he's just a kid, and we've let him do everything that other kids have done. If you look at some of these pictures now, I'm just kind of bragging, but the picture here in the middle at the top, that's we've gotten him into soccer and Special Olympics soccer and bowling, and he was a Boy Scout, and we took him. This is a vacation right here with Snoopy. We made him do everything that other kids would do because it was explained to me like this. If I want my son to act like he has autism, I'm going to send him to that classroom with all the other kids that have autism, and then he'll learn how to be like that. But if I want him to learn how to be like his peers and socially accepted, he's got to see how his peers act. So we had to make sure that he was mainstreamed as much as possible. I made sure that he did all the things that he wanted to do, but that were, he came home to me when he was young and he said, I want to do Boy Scouts. And I said, sure, let's do it. I had no idea how it was going to turn out. But we've got to push him. We got to make him do those things. Otherwise he's never going to learn how to do those things. And at some point he's going to graduate high school, and he's going to have to be in society, out in the community, and he needs to learn how to interact with people in the community. So we did that as much as possible at a young age. All right, let's talk statistics. It says 1 in 59. It's actually 1 in, I think, 52 now is the new they came up with last month. I haven't changed it yet. But the Center for Disease Control says that 1 in 50, I think it's 52 or 54, are now diagnosed with autism. And that's up from 1 in 1,000 in 1980, 1 in 110 in 2007 when he was diagnosed. And it's almost 75% increase since 2007. More prevalent for boys than girls. I don't have the new numbers on this either, but it's pretty close. And you're going to see it is more prevalent in boys than girls, but we are starting to see studies that show a couple of different things. Number one, girls present different than boys. Believe it or not, they're different. It's crazy. Scientists have finally figured this out after years and years. But the other thing is that we see a lot of girls that are diagnosed later, especially high functioning, later on in life, because they're quieter and they don't, they don't present quite the same way. So we may see some of those numbers change, but probably not a whole lot. It's estimated that 1.5 million individuals in the U.S. and tens of millions worldwide are affected by autism. Now, I've been doing this for, it's probably been close to 10 years now. This one gets me every time. According to Autism Speaks, there are more children affected by AIDS than diabetes, AIDS, cancer, cerebral palsy, cystic fibrosis, muscular dystrophy, and Down syndrome combined. That's staggering, and it's crazy. When I first started doing this thing, I would go into a classroom or into a group of people, about 50, and I'd say, how many of you know somebody on the spectrum? And about 3 hands would raise. Here we are almost 10 years later, and if I did the same thing, there may be 1 or 2 hands that are not raised. And what I tell people back then, it was, hey, autism awareness, autism awareness, autism awareness. I mean, we push for awareness, but it's no longer about awareness. It's about acceptance. We're well aware of autism at this point. Classrooms, when I first started teaching or doing these trainings with teachers, I would say, look, if you don't have somebody on the spectrum in your class or haven't had yet, you will. Just wait, it's coming. And now most of them have had at least 2 or 3 in their classroom. So it's not about awareness, it's about acceptance. We have to accept them for who they are. Kids on the spectrum are amazing. Once you figure out how to help them out, to help them cope with some of the issues, and we'll get into that, then you see amazing brains that are just working overtime on specialized things. There are actually companies out in Silicon Valley that hire specifically people on the spectrum because they are so focused and they are so in the groove when they work on things, and they're not necessarily sidetracked by things that some of us other quote unquote neurotypical or normal people get sidetracked with. So it's an epidemic. So I always get, hey, is it because we know what we're looking for now that we have more diagnosis, or is it because whatever's causing this is causing it more? And I think it's a little bit of both. We have more cases identified because we've changed the diagnostic criteria. We know what we're looking for. We can narrow it down more. In fact, some experts, and I don't know how they do this, but they say as early as 6 months now they can diagnose, and some even are looking even earlier than that. I think that's crazy. But hey, if they're seeing it that early, that's actually a pretty good deal. I don't know how they're doing it. Better recognition, low functioning versus high functioning, increased awareness in parents and professionals. We're talking to people. We're going out. We're doing these trainings with you guys. We've worked with over, I think we're getting close to 2,000 educators in the last 8 years or so. And then we work with anybody that'll listen, parents, teachers, I don't care, professionals. I know I've got some people from Creox on here, so we appreciate you guys. So anybody that'll listen, because the quicker that we can help these families, that early intervention, the better. Let's talk about implications of a label real quick. So the only thing that label does, that autism label, is helps us get education services, or the services that we need to help that child out faster. So used to be that I'd walk into a school. This was when Connor was diagnosed, only 10 years ago, believe it or not. And you walk into a school and you hand a diagnosis of autism. They say, oh, he belongs in that classroom down at the end of the hall or out and back. Now schools are getting much better at this, and they know that those kids don't necessarily need those things. They actually work much better at trying to find their deficits, trying to find their strengths, and using their strengths to build upon their deficits. Okay. And that's what every school should do. So that label is nothing other than to get education services, whether that be, and paras are hard. I won't even get into that, but helping out with your therapies, your occupational therapy, your speech therapy. Those are the 2 main ones. And the earlier you can get those things, the better. But you have to have that diagnosis in order to get those things through the school. Misconception associated with prognosis. Again, it's not a cookie cutter diagnosis. Not every kid is the same, and they don't need the same services. So we talk about diagnostic substitution. So a lot of studies now that we're looking at say that high functioning autism, now we're just talking specifically high functioning autism at this point, but high functioning autism and ADHD, severe ADHD, can co-present. They look a lot alike because you have lack of eye contact or spinning and twirling and things like that. So if you don't know specifically what you're looking for, you can actually miss a diagnosis if you're not using the right tools to do that. The other thing is severe anxiety and high functioning autism. We're seeing studies show that those two can actually be misdiagnosis as well. Because they come from the same part of the brain. My wife's working on her psychology degree, her master's in psychology, and she's talking about how all of these things come from the same part of the brain. And they are affecting, again, if I have anxiety, I'm not going to look you in the eye when I'm talking to you, and I'm going to get a little jittery. And so there's a lot of things going on there that we see misdiagnosis. So when we do a recommendation to have somebody diagnosed here at the Pervasive Parenting Center, and this is just our preference, based on what the Oklahoma Autism Center has taught us, is make sure that they're getting a diagnosis with an ADOS, which is the basically gold seal in testing, because if not, there's especially if it's a high functioning, it's something that's like right on the cusp, they can miss some of those diagnoses if they don't know what they're looking for. So, all right. Is there a cure for autism? Obviously not. Kids don't grow out of autism. We give them the tools to cope. For example, if my son is having some issues with sensory processing, which we'll get into in just a minute, or whatever's setting him off, I can give him some of those tools to tolerate or cope with those things at an early age. And then later on, it doesn't look so severe. They're still having those issues, but they've learned how to cope with those. There's no known cure. Again, the educational programs can help. The occupational therapy, the speech therapy, sometimes behavior therapies, depending on the kid and what you're looking for. Unfortunately, in our area, we don't have ABA very close. That's easily accessible, I'll say that. But we do have some behavior therapists in the area that can help with that stuff too. So, all right, comorbidity, fancy word for multiple diagnosis. So when you have kids on the spectrum, a lot of times you have some of these other things. So Connor has, in addition to autism spectrum disorder, he has ADHD, anxiety, OCD, sensory processing disorder. He has developed depression over the last couple of years. So all these things kind of morph together. And I think a lot of them have to do with the fact that, if you look at autism spectrum disorder, again, if I don't have communication or social skills, I'm going to have anxiety. Anxiety will cause me to have depression later on in life. So there are a lot of these things that kind of go along together. And again, ADHD, because it comes from the same part of the brain, you can see where that can be an issue. We have a lot of kids on the spectrum that also have ADHD. So, let's talk quickly about sensory processing disorder, because I think besides communication skills, this is the number one, and it may be the number one issue that we have with behaviors in kids on the spectrum. So sensory processing disorder, I'm going to kind of give this to you in a nutshell. We all have filters, okay? Right now, you guys are sitting wherever you're sitting. I usually do this in the same room, so this is kind of hard, but you guys are sitting wherever you're sitting. You're listening to me. I see a lot of you with your headphones on or whatever, so you can hear me, but what you don't hear is like, and I'm just going to take, for example, where I'm sitting. My computer's got a fan in it that goes crazy, and it's really loud, but I filter that out. The lights above us, no matter where you're at and what kind of light you have, they flicker. Now, we have filters to filter that out, but kids on the spectrum, or adults on the spectrum even, cannot filter those out. And so there's a flicker. We have a lady that works with us. Her name's Kimmy, and she can tell you that every light that she sees flickers. Some are worse than others. LEDs are nice, but they all have a flicker to them. But we've all processed that out. Smells. I mean, everybody has smells, some more than others, but we cover those smells up with deodorant, cologne, perfume, even our hair products have smells in them now. And those things, as the commercial says, you become nose blind to those things. Okay. So, but the kids on the spectrum don't. They're constantly bombarded. So I always like to put this in. This is from a book called The Reason I Jump by Naoki Higashida. He was a 14-year-old kid on the spectrum. Still is. I mean, he's still on the spectrum, but the kid at about 13 or 14 years old, I can't remember, he learned how to communicate through a computer. And he basically wrote a book. And in that book, called The Reason I Jump, he basically said, look, I've been in here the whole time, and here's what I've learned, and here's what I need you to know. And this section I took out because I think it explains sensory processing disorder a lot. So imagine a room where 20 radios are all tuned to different stations, blaring out voices and music. The radios have no on-off switch or volume controls. The lights are constantly flickering in your eyes. Colors and patterns are pouring in from all directions, and they swim and clamor for your attention. The fabric softener in your shirt smells as strong as the air freshener fired up your nostrils. Your jeans feel like steel wool. The floor keeps tilting like a ferry in heavy seas, and you're not sure where your hands and feet are in relation to the rest of you. You can actually feel the plates of your skull, and your head feels like it's trapped inside a motorcycle helmet 3 sizes too small. The air conditioning is as deafening as an electric drill, and the person in front of you sounds like they're speaking into a cell phone on a train going through lots of tunnels. And there's just no relief until you actually go to sleep. So if you imagine this constantly, and we have these kids and we say, sit in your desk, do your homework, do your test, or do all these things, and they have all of this coming at them at one time. And I mean constantly, you can see where behaviors come in, especially if they can't tell you what the problem is. So if we look up here, it says your jeans feel like steel wool. There is a book called Be Different by a guy named John Elder Robison. He wrote another book called Look Me in the Eye, and he was diagnosed at 40 with Asperger's. And he talks about in the book Be Different, there's a chapter called Underwear Have Teeth. And in that, he talks about how he turns his underwear inside out because the seams feel like they're just biting into him. And if you can imagine trying to sit still while that's going on, that it can't be pleasant, right? We used to have a big problem doing buying clothes for Connor. Came August and we had to buy school clothes for him. Anything with plastic on or the vinyl on the front, we couldn't do. Anything with big seams. Socks, he hates the seam in the socks. There's a lot of different things that constantly are just bothering him and affecting him. And so that's a big deal. Now the floor keeps tilting like a ferry in heavy seas. So if you notice some kids on the spectrum, they'll walk into a room and they'll start touching. They'll walk around and they'll touch things. And they're trying to get their bearings on where their body is in relation to everything else. A lot of times because they have issues with vestibular, they can't feel their extremities as well because this isn't neurological. So they don't feel their hands and feet as well as everybody else does, which is why we have flapping, right? That helps them, or twirling. My son, when he was in elementary and middle school, he had his own swing. It was his swing, and everybody else knew not to get on it during recess because it was his, because that's what he liked to do. And that swinging motion helped him to feel his extremities better. So, those little things we don't think about. But if I think about one day we had Connor, he was having meltdowns all day and we couldn't figure out what was going on. He couldn't tell us, was having a hard time. Well, found out that, the little button on the adjustable strap in his pants was cutting into his hip, and we didn't know it. But he couldn't tell us. But he was having meltdowns all day, and until we figured that out, there were a lot of problems. So, before we jump into theory of mind, I want to talk about quickly some things that we were told about Connor, because that just made me think of this. We were told 3 things about Connor when we were young, we were young, but when he was young, these were by experts, and they in no means were trying to be rude. They were just trying to set us up for what the future may be. I had a speech therapist that said Connor may never talk. He was not supposed to talk ever. He had talked a little bit when he was younger, and then he kind of regressed and stopped talking. So we were told that by an occupational therapist that he would probably never ride a bicycle. And then we were told by a longtime teacher that he would probably never, that he would never conform to a regular classroom, a mainstream classroom. My son talks a lot, sometimes a lot more than I would like, but I had another speech therapist that said once we get him to start talking, you're going to wish he'd shut up. And I never have, because he was never supposed to. Now, I wish he had a volume knob sometimes. That would be nice, but I don't wish he would shut up. He can ride a bicycle. He cannot ride a two-wheel bicycle because of some of the balance issues, but that's okay. 2 years ago for Christmas, he got one of those big 3-wheel bikes, and he rides up and down the road with the rest of the kids in the neighborhood, just like he was, the rest of them. And they think he's cool because they like his bike. They want to ride it too, but he says, no, it's his. So, and then he has never been in anything other than a mainstream classroom. And that's not typical, but that is something that we pushed, and we made sure that he was in there with his kids. Now, not every kid can do that. I understand that, but I want to make sure as much as possible that he is in. And we kind of talked about that on inclusion earlier. So let's talk quickly about theory of mind. And I'm going to give you this next 2 slides in a nutshell. Theory of mind is this: what I'm thinking, what you're thinking, what the next person in the next room are thinking are completely different things. Okay, we all have our own brain, and our brains process differently, and we think of different things. Kids on the spectrum, adults on the spectrum, oftentimes, and not always, but oftentimes will lack theory of mind. Again, I'm raising a little Sheldon. So Sheldon Cooper is like this. What is in my brain, because I'm smart and I know these things, you're an idiot because you don't. Okay? And he'll tell you. My son is kind of the same way. He comes off rude sometimes because he'll say, did you not hear what I said? Do you not know what I'm trying to say? Let me give you a couple examples. So this is where we're getting into trouble too as parents, and me especially. Connor's in the computer room, which is two rooms away from where I'm at, okay? 2 walls between us. And I say, Connor, come here. And I wait, because I had to learn how to wait. And I wait, and I don't hear him coming. So I say, Connor, come here. And I hear him yelling at me. I'm already coming. Don't you see me? Well, no, there's 2 walls between us. I cannot see you. So I have no idea. But because he knows that he's on his way, I should know that, because that's lack of theory of mind. Do you not see me coming? Do you not know what's going on in my brain? And that's where we get in trouble. Because I'm going to give you another example. We woke up one morning, this was a couple years ago, but we woke up one morning on a Saturday. So my wife and I are deciding we're going to sleep in, or at least, lay in bed for a little while. And he comes in and says, can I go outside and play? And I said, no, not until we get up and we can kind of keep an eye on you. It's not 5 minutes later, I hear the door open and close. And so I get up and I get dressed and I walk in and I go to the front door, and Connor's across the road in the neighbor's yard, Miss Hawkins. And I said, get over here, Connor. So he comes in. Of course, I'm obviously upset because he disobeyed. I said, Connor, didn't I tell you not to go outside? He says, yes. And you did it anyways? Yes. Why did you do that? Well, because my scooter was across the road in Miss Hawkins' yard. I said, I understand that, but I told you not to go, and you did anyways. Yes. Why would you do that after I told you not to? Well, my scooter's across the road in Miss Hawkins' yard. I said, yes, okay, I get that. But I told you not to do something and you did it anyways, right? Yes. Why? Well, my scooter's across the road and he's giving me the same answer over and over. And we go through this for about 5 minutes and I'm getting frustrated and he's getting frustrated because he's like, do you not hear what I'm telling you? Question is, what was I asking him? Well, why were you going outside? Why did you go outside when you were told not to? Because his scooter was across the road. He's telling me the answer that I'm asking. And so that lack of theory of mind is, do you not understand what's in my brain? What I'm already telling you the question that you are asking. So finally I look at him and I say, look, what I really want you to say is I'm sorry and I won't do it again. He said, okay. So it's probably 30 minutes later and he does something else he's not supposed to. And I ask him why. And we go around and around in circles 2 or 3 times. And finally, after the 3rd time, he goes, I think what you want me to say is I'm sorry and I won't do it again. I said, yes, but you don't understand what I'm trying to say. So I say all that to say this. Because of the lack of theory of mind, a lot of times as parents, our problem, and sometimes as teachers, our problem is lack of communication. And most of the time, it's lack of communication on our side and not theirs. We don't sit and stop and think about what we're trying to get them to say or what we're asking them or how we're asking them. And we'll talk about that here in a minute. But the things that we ask, what am I really trying to get across to him? What do I want him to do? What do I want him to know? And what am I trying to keep him from doing? And we'll get into that, I promise. So all of that is what this said. And I'll just kind of skip through this. I don't know that you guys need too much of this, but this is for, when we're trying to teach early intervention and what we need to look for. We get phone calls to do screenings, and a lot of times we'll kind of go through this list a little bit, but some of the things. So the second one there is, well, the first one is the repetitive behavior, but the second one is repeating words or phrases. So echolalia. Echolalia is so much fun as a parent. And I have to preface that by saying that's sarcasm. That's what I would have to tell my son. That's sarcasm. I have a lot of parents that say, look, my kid repeats things. And I say, yeah, but he doesn't repeat the same phrase verbatim in the same tone for 2 and 3 weeks at a time. Echolalia is not fun. But it was explained to me by Temple Grandin when I was lucky enough to hear her speak. And she said, look, we repeat, or we put on maybe on repeat on a YouTube or something, the same thing over and over because we like that sameness. Remember, we like repetitive behavior. So if everything is the same and it sounds the same and it looks the same over and over, it's comforting for us. So that's why they do that. They'll do the repeating. Tantrums versus a meltdown. I think this is important. I think we should go through this real quick. So a tantrum or a fit, as some of you may know, is an action that is done in order to receive some sort of reward or some sort of a reaction from somebody else. For example, if I go into Walmart and my son wants a bag of Skittles and he says, give me the Skittles, and I say no, he's going to throw a fit. Well, if I give him those Skittles, the action will stop, right? That's a tantrum. That's a fit. A meltdown is when, and I'm going to try to do this the best I can. A meltdown is when my body has had so much, it's overwhelmed, it is overstimulated, and I just can't take any more. Then there's an adrenaline dump. And a meltdown just basically is a release of that adrenaline, and that there's no control over that person's body. They're not controlling it. No matter what I do, I cannot console or control the situation. It just has to take its course. So a meltdown as a parent is the most helpless feeling you'll ever feel, because his eyes glaze over. He throws himself on the floor. I just got to make sure that he's not hurting himself or anybody else. And it just has to take its course, because at this point it's too late. We've already had too much and we've had a meltdown, and we can't stop that. Okay. So I get parents a lot of times, or even teachers, that say, well, he's had a fit. I'll tell you a quick story. So I had a parent and a teacher in the office one time, and they were talking about this kid, and said, well, he had a fit in class the other day. And I said, well, explain it to me. And she said, well, he threw himself on the floor and he was kicking and screaming and doing all this stuff. And I said, okay. And she said, and I noticed at one point it kind of got quiet. And so he looked and he noticed that another kid was looking at him. So he got louder. And I said, yeah, he's looking for a reaction. That is a tantrum. That's a fit. A meltdown, it's not going to happen like that. It's just, and at the end of a meltdown, because it is an adrenaline rush, if you guys have ever had an adrenaline rush, and then you know that you're tired, and they usually feel remorseful at the end too, because they have no idea most of the time what's happened half the time. It's just kind of a strange feeling. So I thought it was important to put in there what the difference between a fit versus a meltdown is. And we'll talk about how we can head off meltdowns here in just a few minutes. I think that, you can look at some of that stuff there. Over and under sensitive to pain, I think that's a big one to talk about. So depending on the child, because this is a neurological, my son is under sensitive to pain. He came in the kitchen one day, he put his hand, on the burner, didn't mean to, but touched the burner, and he looks at my wife and says, I need a Band-Aid. I'd probably be screaming like a little girl, but he said, I just need a Band-Aid. Now, we have a young man who was working with us one summer, and he told us that he doesn't walk on the grass outside without shoes or socks on because it feels like the blades are cutting into his feet. He is oversensitive to pain. We had him filing papers, and he said it felt like just the paper, felt like his fingertips were on fire. So each kid is different. Each person is different with their sensitivity. And you just got to figure out what that is. So let's get into, now that you know a little bit about why they have these behaviors, let's talk about how we can head off these behaviors. So we borrow this from the book, 10 Things Your Student with Autism Wishes You Knew. Now, we do this a lot with teachers, with educators, but I think there's a lot of stuff in here that works well for parents as well, or anybody, maybe some of you in a clinical setting. Ellen Nottbaum she has many great books, but we decided to pull some of these, and I'm going to use her points, but I'm going to throw in things that we've done. And remember, as we go through this, a couple of things. Think of this as a toolbox. What works today may not work tomorrow. And just because it didn't work today doesn't mean it won't work tomorrow. You can keep going back to that toolbox and trying to pull out different tools. The other part of this is if you use these, it works well for all kids, not just those on the spectrum. ADHD, neurotypical, it doesn't matter. A lot of the things we give you work well with all kids. So let's start with behaviors communication. Look, if a kid is acting out, they're having behaviors, they're trying to tell you something. They can't necessarily tell you with their words or their action with their words. So they're going to try to tell you with actions. Behavior is communication. Okay. Again, I told you before, they're not just acting out to be a brat. They're trying to tell you what it is that, is going wrong with them. And they don't, sometimes, especially if they lack communication skills, they're having a hard time of doing that. So we have to figure out what it is that they're trying to say. And again, I tell people sometimes as a parent, especially, or as a teacher, you have to be like Columbo to figure out what they're trying to do. So never assume anything. I love this. Without fact, assumption is only a guess. So look at this. I always tell this story. Never assume what they say is exactly what they mean. Okay? Kids on the spectrum are often black and white, literal. Everything goes, it means one thing. That is if you're telling them. Now, if they're telling you something, they've picked up on something and they may run with it. So I'm going to give you an example of this. Connor is in school one day, and I get a phone call from my wife, and she says, Connor got sent to the principal's office. I said, great, what did he do now? She said, well, he told the teacher that he was going to kill her. I said, great. So now we also have to add counseling to our other therapies. So what's going on? How long is he, out for? And she said, no, we figured some things out. So basically what happened was this day, the actual teacher was out, so they got a sub. Well, instead of paying for a sub, they brought in a para that worked with all the kids in gym, in the PE. Well, every kid knew Miss Candace. And so Miss Candace walks into the room, and there's 15 kids in this classroom, and 14 of those kids get up and just mob her. I mean, they just surround her. Oh, Miss Candace, we love you. Thank you. We're so glad you're here today. Miss Candace has these 14 kids just hugging her and mobbing her, and she says, please go sit down. You guys are killing me. I can't breathe. Go sit down. Everybody go back and sit down. The one kid that didn't get up was my son, believe it or not, as crazy as that is. And she starts taking roll and going on with class. About 3 minutes later, Connor gets up and he walks over to her and says, I'm going to kill you now. Well, I don't blame her. Red flag. Hey, kid tells you he's going to kill you. That's a big problem. So they go to the office. What was he trying to say, though? He was trying to say, what did she say? You're killing me. I can't breathe. Go sit down. It was his turn to give her a hug, but that's not what he said, because what he heard was, you're killing me. Okay, it's my turn to kill you now. So assumptions on what they're trying to say, sometimes we have to dig a little deeper and try to figure out what it is that they're trying to tell you. Okay. Keep an open mind. They're very smart. So, most of the time, kids on the spectrum are extremely smart. Even those that are nonverbal, that they can't tell you how smart they are. Most of the time, if we can figure out a way to communicate with them, we find out that they are extremely smart. Now, I'm going to give you an example of this. When Connor was first diagnosed, they did an IQ test, and I don't put a whole lot into IQ tests. I'm sorry, I don't. I mean, it's used basically to help get services, but beyond that, I don't see much in that. I'll tell you why, because depending on the day, who's given the test, whether or not he's having a good day or not, whether he wants to do the test, that IQ test can go a lot of different ways. So when Connor was first diagnosed, they told us that his IQ was, I think, a 68, something like that, which would have put him intellectually disabled. I said, fine, I don't know. He's not very verbal, so who knows what. 3 years later, he had us a new diagnosis, or not a new diagnosis, a new evaluation, and we have a new psychologist who decides to give him an IQ test for nonverbal people. Even though he could speak more now because we had been getting him services, she said, we're going to give him an IQ test for nonverbal. It comes back at a 131, which is borderline genius. So again, you tell me the difference between 3 years other than we had some therapies, but that's not going to change the IQ by that much. It's just going to depend on, again, the day and what happens. But I think they're extremely smart, and they are very focused on certain things. So that's a really good thing. All right. Here's some tips I always give parents and teachers. If I'm talking to a kid and I say, hey, I need you to go in the living room, get your shoes, take them in the kitchen, and put them on a shelf. Okay? Again, when I was younger, my dad would be, you do what you're told when you're told, and do it now. No waiting. That's disrespectful. Well, that's a problem when my son, again, has to take all that information, process it down from that brain that was on the right to the brain that was on the left. So if I tell him that, he's probably thinking, okay, what shoes? They're in the kitchen. Okay, where's the kitchen? Which shelf do I need to take him to? I need to put them here, and so all of that stuff takes a lot longer to go from the ears and the eyes into the brain and then make your body do whatever it's supposed to. So I had a speech therapist one time that said, what do you really want to work on? And I said, well, my son doesn't do what he's told when he's told. And she said, well, how long do you give him? And I said, well, I want it done now. And she just laughed at me. She said, that's not going to happen. But here are some tips, okay? Always give a few seconds repeating. Now, this says approximately 15 seconds, but count to 15, okay? Connor, go in the living room, get your shoes, take them in the kitchen, put them on a shelf. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. After counting to 15, I look at him. If I still see that it's taking a while to process, he's not getting it, everything's not, he's not moving. And let me stop real quick, because Connor, we had his hearing tested, by the way, at least 3 or 4 times when he was younger. My wife said that he basically, his hearing, there was something wrong with his hearing. We'd walk into a room and say, Connor, 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 and over, and he wouldn't respond. Well, I knew there wasn't anything wrong with it, because he was in his bedroom and we were in the living room, and I turned on Thomas, and he comes running in from 2, rooms away. He can hear. It's the way he processes the information and how quickly. So then what do we do? So then we ask again, you change proximity. Now, I usually do this in a room full of people, and then I'll walk up to somebody and I'll say, Connor, go in the living room, get your shoes, take them in the kitchen, put them on the shelf. And I do 3 things. I say his name. I change proximity so I can get closer. If I'm talking from far away, I could be talking to anybody in the room. But if I get close to you and right up next to you, then you know that I'm talking to you, and I lower my voice, because contrary to popular belief, if we lower our voice instead of raise it, they listen better. Okay, something that I, as a parent, have a hard time figuring out. So this is where I stop for a second and tell you, I am not the perfect dad. I can sit here and tell you this stuff, and then when I go home, I make things worse, because it gets frustrating. You get the same thing over and over again. Okay, but as I told my son yesterday, my youngest son, I said, the only person that I have to compete with is myself. And I got to make sure that tomorrow I'm a better dad than I was today. And so some days that's hard, okay? But if I lower my voice instead of raising it, which I try, then he listens better than when I yell at him, okay? Because usually when I yell at him, he just shuts off. So that's not a good thing. When repeating, change the tone of voice. Softer works. Extremely stressed, especially when the child's extremely stressed. Reduce the amount of speech. Okay, so here's what I call the cut the crap method, because I have no better words for it. But I said, go in the living room, get your shoes, take them in the kitchen, put them on the shelf. That's a lot of words for a kid, especially a kid that takes longer to process. That's a lot of words for him to process down, right? So instead of saying that, let's start with small words and we can add, because once I get that big sentence out, it's already out, and he can't. He's going to keep processing. Let's start with less words. So if I just said, Connor, shoes, shelf, please. That's 4 words. I said his name and I was polite. I'm saying the same thing. Now I can add, Connor, get your shoes, please. We can add words, but it's better to add than to subtract. We can't take them away once they're already out there. So the smaller the amount, the better. Let's see. We found out that for whatever reason, asking the who, what, when, where, why questions to somebody on the spectrum, it's harder for them to take those and process them as easily as another way. So if you're asking, again, remember that communication, a lot of times the problem is on our end and not on their end, okay? So if we are asking a question and it's just not getting through to them, step back for a second and think, what am I asking, and can I ask it in a different way, okay? And the example we always give here is, where are you going, versus, oh, I see you're leaving. Is it time to leave? I didn't ask the who, what, when, where, why questions, okay? I just changed the way I said it. So if you're getting frustrated, the kid's getting frustrated, and you don't understand, stop for a second and say, can I rephrase this in a way that would possibly make them better understand it, okay? Let's look for sensory issues first. Remember, sensory processing disorder is one of the main causes of behaviors in children, okay? And especially if you have communication issues, then we can't tell you what is bothering us. So I say that they can't tell you verbally. So how do they tell you? Well, kids on the spectrum often have stems, okay, where they stimulate, self-stimulate, or they're trying to regulate their bodies in some sort of way. Some people see this as annoying. For me, it's a key. It helps me to know that something's going on, and I can start to head things off ahead of time. So Connor, like a lot of kids on the spectrum, tend to pace back and forth. He does this little gallop pace sometimes, especially when he's getting really overstimulated or when he's getting overexcited. And you can tell the difference between the two, but there's a pacing. I see that and I start asking questions. Connor, are you okay? Do you need anything? Can we start, I may start helping him with how to become not as stimulated. And we'll talk about that here in a minute. Rocking. A lot of kids on the spectrum like to rock, either standing or sitting, but they'll rock back and forth. That's a stim. That's a sign. Repeating things, echolalia kicks in. We start to repeat. I start asking questions. Connor, are you okay? What's going on? That's their way of coping. Remember, it, as Temple said, it's helping them to cope. It's helping them to relax. Cover his ears. Okay. Look, I don't want my kid to suffer, but I know if he's covering his ears, at least we're looking for a sound. So that's a good one. And we see a lot of kids on the spectrum that'll cover their ears a lot. Okay. There we go. Chew on things, pencils, clothes, arms. I've got one family I'm working with, and the kid bites his pinkies. So lots of different things. There's jewelry. If you've never heard of jewelry, those things help. It's basically like just a necklace that they can chew on, or they have wrist bracelets, and there's even stuff that you can put, pencil toppers that you can put on there, and just helps them for the chewing. But I know that chewing is stimming, so if they're starting to do that, we need to start looking at why they're doing that. And ultimately, Connor would scream. He had, a time when he would let out this real high-pitched yelp. Those things are pretty annoying. I think the most annoying one, and he's still doing this one, is he, as he says, clears his throat. Now, clearing our throats, that's our clearing our throat, right? Not for Connor. Connor clears his throat by going, which sounds like he's hawking a loogie or something, and it is disgusting. You do that in a restaurant and watch everybody around you just kind of get queasy. It's not fun. Try doing that on a vacation trip in a car for 12 plus hours, and that's just constantly going on. It's not fun, but it's his stim. It's his way of trying to self-regulate. So anyways, those are some of the things. So we look at those things. We look at those stems. We start noticing those things going on. And when we do, then we can start to head off a meltdown ahead of time, okay? So a lot of parents ask me, what do I do when my kid has a meltdown? Well, the hard part is once they've had the meltdown, there's not much you can do. Again, make sure that they're not hurting themselves or others, and then let it take its course. But if we can head these things off, if we can see some of these things ahead of time, these stems, then we can start doing some things to allow them a break. And here's some of the things that we've done. If a kid likes pressure, and you gotta, again, kids are different. You gotta figure out what they like. Connor loves pressure, so weighted vests, weighted blankets, anything like that helps. Connor, I'd tell you about Connor sandwiches. So what we used to do with Connor, we don't do it so much anymore. He's learned how to cope pretty well with a lot of his stuff. That doesn't mean we don't have meltdowns, especially since everything with the quarantine, things have gotten kind of crazy. But we have had a few, but not as much as we did when we were little, because he knows how to cope with those things. But we used to, when I'd start to see him do some of those signs, he would start pacing or rocking, and I would lay him down on either a couch or on the bed, and then we had one of those big body pillows, and I would put on top of him, and then I would just apply pressure of my body on top of him, and you can just feel the tension release from his body. He loves that pressure. Not every kid is that way. You got to figure out if they are or not. Stress balls work pretty well, something to kind of squeeze. Trampoline has been one of our saviors during quarantine. Every time he starts to get frustrated, I send him out to the trampoline. He probably thinks it is a punishment, but it's really not. I'm trying to get him to release some of that stress. So So we talk about sandpaper, fur, or silk, again, depending on the kid. Now, Connor likes rough stuff, so, and we've had some kids that really do. So we took just a little square of low grit sandpaper. You don't want to tear everything up, and taped it underneath of a desk. And while he's sitting in that desk, he can just kind of rub on that, and it causes him to calm. If they don't like that rough texture, let's say Nick, the kid that we had in here during the summer, fur or silk. And I've seen, especially, I know girls a lot like these little silk handkerchiefs that they'll just rub on. I've seen that before. But anything that is a sensory seeking, because that's what they're doing. They're sensory seeking. You kind of are building, and if you talk to an occupational therapist about any of this stuff, they'll help you with it. But a sensory diet, they're trying to build a sensory diet. So that's some of the things you can do. Bean bags are great because you sit in a bean bag and that bean bag just basically envelops you. It just comes around you. So you've got that pressure. A quiet corner. When we were in elementary school, he had a corner that was just his, and he could go in there and it could be quiet, and we had a great teacher that decided one time, we had a quiet room. Okay, so let me kind of tell this story. We had a quiet room, which was this room that they had set up, and it was kind of a storage room, but they put in a corner of it this big box. I think it was like a washing machine box or something, and we decorated it. And Connor could go down there when he started to get frustrated, and he could get in there and close the door, and it was dark and it was quiet, and he could spend 5-10 minutes in there until he basically decompressed. Then he would get back and go back to the classroom. The problem with this was it worked really well until he got back to the classroom, and then he wanted the teacher to reteach everything that he missed in the 10 or 15 minutes because he wanted to hear everything. So the teacher, we were trying to figure out how we could fix this. I mean, there was no way. And so the teacher finally went out and bought one of those kind of round hanging shower curtains. It's on a hoop, and she put it back in the corner of her room, put a bean bag in the bottom, and he could go back in the corner and put that around him and close everything off, but he could still hear her teaching. So he wasn't missing instruction, but he was closing everybody else off, and it was kind of nice. So that worked really well. Again, you got to get the right teacher. You got to get the school on board with that. But if you can, it works pretty well. Earplugs and headphones, depending on the kid, especially if they have sensory to hearing. Connor never liked anything on his ears or in his ears, so that didn't work for him. But a lot of kids we've gotten, and I'll tell you, when we talk about, I'm going to give you a couple real quick tips. Walmart, the sporting goods section is a great place to go on a budget. So a weighted vest, if you guys have ever seen one of those, the weighted vests are like big gray or white, and they have these pockets, and then they put these weighted beanbag things in there, and they're pockets on the back and pockets on the front. They cost you anywhere from $100 to or $80 to $120, depending on what you're getting. And you got to go through an occupational therapist. And well, we had that, and part of the problem was that he stood out. I mean, you're wearing this gray looking thing in class, and my kid doesn't need any more attention drawn to him anyway. So what we did is we went to the sporting goods section. We found it was during hunting season. We found one of those little hunting vests that for kids, they've got them in there. They've got all the little pockets all over them. We went the next aisle over. We grabbed cornhole bean bags. We put those in the pockets. We have our own weighted vest for less than $30. And he doesn't stand out. He just looks like he's wearing a camouflage vest. This was during the Duck Dynasty thing, so everybody thought he was real cool anyway. So now, the earplugs and headphones, you go to the next aisle over, and they have the noise-canceling headphones for shooting, target stuff. So, and all for less than what you would do if you went through a specialty store. So, just a simple walk. hey, get them away from the situation. If there's something in there that's bothering them, get them away from the situation and come back when they're calmed down. Any of these can do wonders. Again, these are things that we've worked with a lot of kids on. So, okay, tell me what you want to do in a positive rather than an imperative. Kids on the spectrum can feel frustration, probably multiplied sometimes. This is where I tell you that, again, I'm not the perfect dad, and I've caused more problems probably than I've helped, but I've learned from those in that if I get frustrated, I have to take a second and stop and step back from the situation and say, okay, I'm not doing any good by yelling or getting frustrated and causing the situation to escalate. I have to stop myself and think about what I'm doing, think about what I'm asking, think about what I'm saying. It's counterproductive and usually results in a meltdown. I've caused a lot of meltdowns for my son that I regret, but it just happens. All right, keep your expectations reasonable. We talk about assemblies. I like to throw this story in here. So how important is an assembly? First of all, we've been doing this for years. I think we're going on, again, I can't think, somewhere between 8 and 10 years that I've been doing this, especially with teachers. Teachers, we're getting close to 1,800 to 2,000 that we've done this with. And in that time, I ask teachers, how many of you like cafeteria duty? In 8+ years, almost 2,000 teachers, I've had 2 people raise their hand. Teachers do not like cafeteria duty. It's noisy, it's hectic, it's smelly. If you think about the sensory processing, we have smells coming from all different directions in a cafeteria. People are having conversations over here and over there. It's not to mention all the movement. So then you have a visual distraction. So all of these things are going on in a cafeteria. So how do you get your kid who has sensory processing disorder to sit in a cafeteria? Well, it's not easy. I'll just tell you that, and it takes some time. But I'll tell you what we did with Connor and what we've done with a couple other kids. When we first started with him in the cafeteria, it wasn't happening. He was having meltdowns immediately, and we knew that was going to happen. So we would just remove him, and we decided he would just have lunch in a classroom that was right next to the cafeteria. Well, that wasn't doing him any good because he needs to learn how to cope with that. So what we decided was, okay, for the first week or two, we're going to put him in the cafeteria for, let's say, 3 minutes. I'm just throwing this out here. So let's say 3 minutes. If he starts to have a meltdown, then we remove him from the situation. But we keep going until he can take 3 minutes. Then we add and go to 5 minutes. Keep doing that. If he starts to have a meltdown, we take him out. Then we add to 7, to 5, to 10, to 15, whatever the case may be. And you just keep adding. And you're building a tolerance. And you're just basically helping them to the point that now that he can, by the time he was, I think it was 3rd, 4th grade, he was in the cafeteria full time and wasn't a problem. We talk about assemblies. He used to do assemblies with headphones on until a couple of years ago, and then everything was fine. He could sit in there the whole time and didn't bother him. As you can see behind me, I'm a huge Kansas City Chiefs fan. If anybody knows anything about the Chiefs, Arrowhead Stadium is the loudest stadium in the NFL. My wife and I decided we love the Chiefs, so we were going to take the boys to a Chiefs game. Well, you've got a kid on the spectrum with sensory issues, and I thought, this is never going to work, but we're going to do it anyways because we need to see what he would do. He loved it. Now, by this time, we had built up that tolerance. We'd worked on it, everything. But I tell you what he loved the most was, if you've ever been in a stadium like that that's going crazy and yelling and screaming constantly, you get this kind of a weird whir going in your ear. He loved that he could scream and yell as much as possible and nobody made him stop. And that was his kind of like, he loved to do that. So anyways, we wouldn't have been able to do that, 7, 8, 9 years ago. Help me transition between activities. That's going to be one of the biggest things. So many times I have, especially, we have a lot of issues with younger kids, whether it be Head Start, pre-K, kindergarten, first. Usually those are our biggest problem times, for a couple of different reasons. We're getting diagnosis then. We're starting to see a lot of the signs. Parents are just getting the diagnosis and trying to learn things. But one of the biggest things we see in the classroom is that when you're trying to transition, if you just up and move, remember those kids that routine. If you just constantly say, okay, we're moving to, and I always think about centers, if I'm in the block center and you say, okay, it's time to go to the next center, let's go to computers, and that kid's not done, we'll have meltdowns. We see that so many times. So I always ask them, do you give any kind of a warning? Verbal warnings are great. We do this at home still to this day, and it works again with all kids, not just kids on the spectrum. I'll say, Connor, Cruz, bath time, 5 minutes. Then I'll do a backward, countdown. Connor, bath time in 2 minutes. Okay, 1 more minute, and then it's time for a bath. It gives him time to think about what he's doing and what he needs to do to finish up where he's at, okay? We talk about visual schedules. Terry Arbery, who is my classroom guru that has worked she was a teacher that worked in the classroom for 33 years. She has, when we go into a classroom, one of the first things she looks for, there she is over my shoulder, there's Terry. One of the first things that she does is she looks for a visual schedule. Do we have a visual schedule in this classroom? And I've started doing it too because of her. Anything that shows that this is going to happen here, this is going to happen here, this is going to happen here. It doesn't have to have times on it necessarily. I mean, those work, those help. But anything that can show me an order that we're going to be in that day. Visual timers. You can get these on iPad. You can get an actual visual timer in person, or you can get them on your phone, whatever. But you can have a countdown, either a backwards countdown or just a count up. It doesn't matter, but as long as that kid can see, okay, I have this amount of time, I have a visual timer here, that'll help me. Those are some things that we really work with in the classroom, especially, but again, it works at home. Hey guys, it's almost time for bed, 5 more minutes, finish up what you're doing. So don't make a bad situation worse. Again, self-explanatory, but it goes along with number 5. One of the things I would say is this. For every, and this is a psychological thing, but for every one thing that you tell a kid that is bad, it takes 5 positives to equal 1 negative. Does that make sense to you guys? I hope. Every time I tell a kid something negative, I'm going to have 5 positives to kind of reinforce or build them back up. Some of the ways that we can get around that is, instead of telling them the bad things that they do, how many times do we actually praise them for what they do right? And this is hard because, again, we're built on this, okay, don't do this, stop doing that, quit, to the point that those kids turn off, okay? I can tell Connor I can say, don't, quit, stop. I had a therapist tell me, how many times in a day do you tell him no? And I said, I don't know. And she said, I'm going to give you an assignment. You go home, and I want you to count every time that you tell him no. And when you come back, I want you to tell me. Within an hour, I was well over 30, and I just gave up. And I thought, I get what you're trying to say. What she was trying to explain to me was, how many times do we tell them what we want them to do as opposed to what we don't want them to do, okay? Instead of telling them don't run, well, walk, and I know that seems simple, but it's the thing we never explain. Here's the way it was explained to me. If somebody is starting to get frustrated, what do we tell them? Calm down. How many of you have ever had somebody explain to you how to calm down? We just assume that people know how to calm down because since we were kids, that's what people say, calm down. Kids on the spectrum don't know how to calm down. Nobody has ever explained it to them. Take deep breaths, count to 10, instead we just throw things out and they're like, okay, I don't get what that means. What does that mean? And then they get frustrated. So it's better to explain to them what you want them to do as opposed to what you don't want them to do. And that's always a good thing. Use the hey, Connor, thank you for standing in line. I mean, and it doesn't have to be Connor. It can be everybody. You can actually use kids next to you, and I'll get into this here in just a minute. But if I want Connor to do something and I see somebody else doing it, let's praise them. Jason, thank you so much for standing in line and keeping your hands to yourself. That was very nice. Well, Jason's standing right next to Connor, and Connor sees that and says, oh, he got praised for that. I think I'll do that. Now, if that's what you're wanting to do, you make sure that as soon as you see Connor do the thing that you want him to do, you praise him, because that is what he was looking for, and that was what you were looking for. Okay? So, criticize gently, and this is the same thing, self-explanatory. So more than we can treat, and those kind of go together. More than we critique, let's tell them the good things as opposed to the bad things. Let's get them involved. I also use this as an example. We go to the grocery store, especially when he was younger, and Connor would be all over the place, you know, and I'm that dad that I don't want my kid running all over the place, so I would be pulling him back. Stop doing this, quit, whatever. Well, I had somebody explain to me, hey, how do you get him involved in what you're doing? And I said, what do you mean? I'm just trying to wrangle him. I'm trying to keep him from climbing the shelves. And she said, you have a list, don't you? And I said, yeah. Well, ask him to participate in getting the stuff on the list. You want rice? Go grab that bag of rice for me, please, and put it in the bag. You know, if they're participating, and this worked for Cruz too, because he has severe ADHD, but if you get them involved in doing those things, then his brain is doing something other than just wandering. So he's involved. So those things help a lot. Positive reinforcements. Okay. So let's talk quickly about positive reinforcements for those of you who don't know what this means. There is a huge difference between bribery and positive reinforcements. Remember earlier I was talking about the fits. If I have a kid that's throwing a fit and he wants the Skittles, then I'm going to give him the Skittles so he'll shut up. Okay? What's going to happen the next time I go to the grocery store? He's going to throw the fit again, or it's going to get worse because he knows he's getting his way. Okay? So that is bribery. I'm going to give you this in order to stop an action. Positive reinforcement is this. Connor, and we do this, I promise we do. And it took a while, but Connor, if we go into Walmart and you are good while I'm grocery shopping, I'm getting all my groceries, at the end, if you want the Skittles, I will give you the Skittles, but I do not reward bad behavior. My kids will tell you I say that all the time. I do not reward bad behavior. I will reward good behavior. If you're good, when we get to the checkout, you can have any kind of candy that you want, but you better be good. And they know they have to be, because I'm the dad that will throw you over a shoulder, and I will walk out of Walmart and leave a whole bag full of stuff or a cart full of things, because I've had to teach my kids, and it took one or two times of me just walking out of there without them getting what they wanted. It's hard, but it works. Now they know that if they're good, by the time we're done, they'll get the thing that they wanted. So those are positive reinforcements, and I'm reinforcing the good as opposed to the bad. Let's see. All right, and this is the last one here. Offer real choices and only real choices. So we can give kids choices and make them think that they're in control, okay? They think they have a choice to do. Okay, so Connor, do you want to do your homework first or clean your room? Now, I know that sounds crazy to some of you, and it can be. And some kids get smart to this a little bit, but especially when they're younger, this works pretty well. You mean I have a choice? I can do one or the other. I think I'll clean my room first. I don't want to do my homework. Connor, do you want to write your name or the date first on the paper? Oh, I get to choose? I'll do my name first, you know, and then again, once they do it and they do what you want them to do, hey, thank you so much. That was really good. Thank you for choosing, you know, thank you for doing your name. Your room looks really clean. Thank you so much. Give them those praise. Give them choices, though, and only real choices. use peers. At the bottom here, you see it says, see how Jason's writing his name on his paper? Thank you, Jason. Thank you so much. And then Connor says, oh, Jason wrote his name and he got praised, so I'll do that. And then as soon as he does, make sure that you immediately give him that praise. Okay? And then sometimes I say, we don't give choices. Because if I say, Cruz, do you want to take a bath? Every time it's going to be no. He does not want to take a bath. Okay? But, so sometimes we just say, oh, it's bath time. Hey, 5 more minutes and it's bath time. We don't give them a choice. We have to. But I always tell parents, teachers, whatever, pick your battles, okay? One day you may want to work on some of this stuff. One day maybe you're having a bad day and you don't even feel like messing with it. So keep in mind that depending on the day, you may want to say, okay, it's bath time, or give them choices. You guys kind of understand what I'm saying with that. But that's pretty much our training. I mean, we basically, again, what works one day doesn't always work the next day. One thing, though, that does frustrate me is when I have either a parent or a teacher that says, well, we tried that and it didn't work. And I said, okay, but how many times did you try it? Well, we tried it once and they wouldn't do it. They weren't having it. Well, did you go back to it? Did you try it again? No. Listen, if you try it again and you've tried it 2 or 3 times in 2 weeks or so, and it may not work, fine. But if you tried it once and it didn't work, you don't know, whether or not that's, the only time or the only thing that won't work. So you keep going back to those tools that we give. And that's basically what all this information is. It's just tools. I put up our information here. I'm going to give you guys something too quickly, that if you have any questions, if you want a copy of the PowerPoint, I'm going to give you an email in just a second, so you guys get ready. And you email me and I will send you a copy. You just say, I want a copy of the PowerPoint in there, and I'll send it to you as much as possible. But you want to give Terry?
I just sent a message that if they'd send me their email, as
okay.
They've been sending me email, I've been sending it out.
Terry, okay, so Terry said that she's been doing that too, but I'll go ahead and give you mine too in case you missed that. My email is ktoney, Toney. This is the part that is bad, but at pervasiveparentingcenter.org. ktoney, Toney, at pervasiveparentingcenter.org. And if you'll just email me and say, hey, I want that, I'll send you a copy of the PowerPoint. I hope this helped. Again, what we hope you understand is why they're having behaviors, and then what you can do to kind of head some of those behaviors off.